no, no, heck no, no, nah, nada, zilch, no. When you say no, you'd think that two simple letters would be much easier to say, but when it comes to saying that one small word to potential clients, it can be hard. Believe me, I've been there too. There were a lot of times as a photographer that I made the mistake of taking on clients because either I needed the work or because I didn't know how to say no, even if I knew we were not a good fit. I finally reached a breaking point and I realized something. Life is too short to work with people who are not a good fit for you. Now, I realize how tempting it is to say, like, oh, we should say yes to everything thrown our way. But not all opportunities are created equal, and you're the only person who will advocate for your business. When I started implementing my if it ain't a hell yes, then it's a hell no policy, it wasn't about the money anymore. Saying no was for my time and my sanity. You don't need to say yes to every client or contract or opportunity. I am here to help you learn from my mistakes. Yes, I said mistakes, so you can avoid those miserable feelings that I experienced way too many times. That's just real talk. Here are 2 ways that you could say no without feeling guilty. My first tip is to simply tell potential clients a straight no. Like, my favorite way to say no with dignity and with grace is the classic phrase, it's not you, it's me. So, for example, I would say to potential photography clients, when the minute I realized that we would not be a good fit, maybe after I met with them, I would email them or tell them straight out, I don't think I'm gonna be the photographer to document your special day in the way that you desire. You can also go the extra mile and suggest other options for them to explore, such as a professional referral. And yeah, I believe that honesty works in any industry. Remember, there's no such thing as a hard or easy conversation. It's just a conversation that needs to be had. The second way to say no is to give yourself a backdoor option. When I was just starting out my business, telling somebody no right off the bat and then letting them find another option, well, that was the route I just took. That was what I just explained. But as my business began to grow, I began to offer premium services. My market changed to be rather luxury clients. So I needed to provide more of a solution if I told them no, because the luxury market is very small and I didn't want to burn any bridges. Now, anytime somebody reached out to me, any client, any art director, editor, my standard protocol was to tell them that a date-specific event would have to be approved to ensure that another client wasn't going to book on the same day. And so I said, I can't commit to anything without running it by them first. Okay, so leaving this back door open, it kind of gave me time to process my thoughts and decide whether or not I wanted to take the client. If I decided that I didn't want to, I wouldn't be blindsiding them because I had told them from the beginning, hey guys, it might not work. Also, because they were high-end clients, I provided at least 3 other recommendations for them to check out so that I wasn't leaving them high and dry. What I want to do is kind of like cushion the news, So I hope this video helps you say no. Say no to clients who disrespect your time. No to contracts that don't value your worth. No to opportunities that leave you feeling depleted instead of feeling excited. By saying no, you're gonna open your schedule and your life to yes. Saying yes when the right opportunities come your way. As a reminder, know your worth and then add tax.